Hey y'all, this is Texans Takes with James Roy. I'm James Roy, and today on the show we're going to be talking about Tony Boselli. I recently found a jersey of his intact out in town in Temecula, and I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about the defensive line position. Jacob Martin's back. Jadeveon Clowney has shown interest in coming back. There's a lot of questions around that group. And then I want to break down the tight end position. And to close out the show, we'll take a question from Twitter. So let's get started. So I was recently out at the Promenade in Temecula, the mall out here in Southern California near where I live. And I was at a vintage store. I saw they had a jersey rack. Only reason I went into the store. I searched through all of them because on the off chance that they had anything Houston related, I might consider buying it. They had a lot of Maverick stuff. They had a lot of obscure jerseys coming around the bend. I was surprised to find that they had a Texans jersey. I was not surprised at the player that was on it. It was number 71, but not Titus Howard, Tony Boselli. Tony Boselli is a Hall of Famer. He was drafted as the first overall pick in the expansion draft to the Texans. Unfortunately, he spent the entire following season on the IR and just never really panned out, announced his retirement after that. He eventually signed a one-day contract and retired with the Jaguars. A lot of Texans fans probably don't really consider him a Texan just based off of how short he was on the team and how much it adversely affected a team that drafted David Carr, needed an offensive line, and then drafted an offensive lineman who is really had a great career, but just didn't pan out, didn't really play for the Texans. And so I understand all of that around that. Ultimately, I didn't decide to buy it. Maybe that's a mistake. There's some people saying that I should, some saying that I shouldn't. It'll probably still be there if I want to go get it. But for now, I'm leaving it on the rack. The Texans recently brought back Jacob Martin, and it sparked an interesting discussion on Texans Twitter. I for one, thought that the Rock Boyz era was fun at times. Obviously, a lot of that time period for the Texans defense is associated with misery and loss and not fun, but it had its moments, right? So I thought the Rock Boyz era was fun. There are some people that don't think it was. Now, am I advocating for the Rock Boyz to return because Jacob Martin signed? Absolutely not. I think that this team is past that identity, and when you move forward as a team, you have to find a new thing to identify around. I almost would venture out to say that identifying with the Bulls on Parade is just something that I'm not fully for. I don't think that looking backwards is something that you do as a team. You got to find a new identity that all these guys that are on the team right now can identify around. I mean, the other part of this too is that Jacob Martin is a fringe, player to make the roster. So let's see him make the roster first. Then we'll talk about bringing back the Rock Boyz. And as has been the theme of this offseason, another former Texan has been thrown out in the rumor mill as someone who could potentially return, and that Texan is Jadeveon Clowney. Now, Jadeveon Clowney is in no rush to sign, but he made a comment to the local news stations in Houston because he works out and lives out here in the offseason that he wouldn't mind coming back. He likes D'Amico Ryans. What else is new? Jadeveon Clowney's return would make sense from the perspective that the run defense was the worst in the league last year, but as it stands right now, the Texans have 10 defensive ends on the roster, so it's hard to believe that they would sign him without dropping one of the others. It's not saying that they would prioritize the 10 here over him if he was open to it and D'Amico thought that he fit. Personally, like I said, I think that because of his prowess on run defense, he's at least worth taking a look at. His time in Houston ended on a good note in terms of his production at the very least. And so it'd be worth exploring that. I think he'd be a good rotation guy at the very worst on this team. On this week's episode, we're looking at the tight end group for our position breakdown. So to catch you up to speed, I'm trying to pick who I think the Texans will carry into the season on the 53-man roster. I'm not really looking forward at numbers. I'm just hoping and praying that I come up with 53 men at the end of it. So far, I have 7 from the running back and the quarterback position. And now we're looking at tight end. Currently, there are 4 tight ends on the roster in Dalton Schultz, Mason Schreck, Tegan Quintariano, and Brevin Jordan. I would say that there's one cut there. I think that the Texans carry 3 tight ends into the season. It's between Mason Schreck and Brevin Jordan, in my opinion. I think that Brevin Jordan as a pass-catching tight end has been a little disappointing. And I don't want to say he doesn't provide anything else, but he's not necessarily strong at the other aspects of being a tight end. So he either has to show something as a pass catching, smaller speed tight end in the offseason, or he's gone. I mean, that's just my thoughts on it. If I'm guessing right now, I would say based off where he was drafted and them hoping that he pans out, that Mason Schreck is the odd man out. So I would say that it's Dalton Schultz, TQ, and Brevin Jordan. So that brings us up to 10 players so far in the position breakdown. And with that, we'll take a question from Twitter. Patton from Twitter asks, who are your starting linebackers? Now, I personally am not an expert at who should start and who shouldn't. I'm looking at the Texans depth chart right now, and as it stands in a base 4-3 defense, we're looking at the will linebacker being Christian Harris, the middle linebacker being Christian Kirksey, and the Sam linebacker being Denzel Perryman. That makes sense to me as it stands. I've mentioned it before, but the deeper question here is Christian Kirksey going to be on the roster past June? Because the Texans can save a significant amount of cap space by cutting him. There's a lot of people in the fan base that think he has underperformed relative to expectation. The question becomes, do the Texans believe that Henry To'o or Garrett Wallow are up to the task of starting at middle linebacker? Because if they don't, they either need to sign another middle linebacker, a veteran of sorts, or they need to stick with Kirksey. That's just what it comes down to. Personally, as it stands on the roster, I agree with the current positions. Christian Harris will start at will, Christian Kirksey at middle, and Denzel Perryman at the Sam linebacker. That's subject to change. I think throughout the offseason, we'll see how the Texans are feeling about it. And towards the end of the preseason, as they make cuts, we'll probably get a very firm feel about how the Texans feel about it. This has been Texans Takes with James Roy. I have been James Roy. Thanks for listening. If you like Houston sports, particularly the Dynamo, Rockets, or Astros, I also do videos on them on my YouTube channel, so you should subscribe if you're interested. And if you like this video, you should like it. And if you have any feedback for me, leave a comment below. And if you want to find me on social media, it is at M1 Texans Fan. Thanks for watching, and stay classy, Houston.